Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Morse and I am the Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trust and a member of the Catchment-Based Approach Biodiversity Working Group. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this webinar to discuss the data and evidence available to support habitat restoration and nature's recovery. This webinar is being hosted by the Catchment Data User Group as part of the CDUG Data and Evidence Forum this year. But this particular, this is one of a series of webinars, but this particular session today is being delivered in partnership with the CaBA Biodiversity Working Group, which exists to champion and support biodiversity delivery by those working across our catchments. You are going to hear today from a number of speakers. We're going to start with a bit of policy context around biodiversity delivery to set the scene. And then you'll hear from a series of speakers to discuss the tools, resources and techniques that are available to practitioners to help them plan and prioritise biodiversity delivery across our catchments. The most substantial item that we're going to hear about today is around a piece of work being led by Natural England to develop restoration potential maps for priority habitat, river and lakes. And you'll hear about the opportunities to get involved with this really interesting piece of work. And then at the end of the session, we will have 15 minutes or so available for discussion. But a number of the talks that you're going to hear today have been pre-recorded so that the speakers themselves can be on hand to answer your questions as the webinar is progressing. So please do use the Q&A function throughout the whole of the session, not just at the end. It should be visible if you sort of hover over the bottom of your screen, and you can send us questions throughout the afternoon and we will do our best to answer those for you. Any questions that we don't manage to answer today, we will take away and try and provide some answers for you later. And this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar and any outputs from it will be made available on the CaBA website. Before I hand over to our first speaker, one final thing I'd like to share with you is that for the Biodiversity Working Group, this webinar is the first in a series that we will be helping to deliver. We are going to be running a series of webinars over the next couple of months, focusing on biodiversity aspects of catchment delivery, including around how government policy can support biodiversity delivery, and looking at some of the key freshwater and wetland habitat types that might be of interest to practitioners, including ponds and floodplain meadows. So we will be advertising these webinars on the CaBA forum, so do please keep your eyes peeled for those. I think that's everything I wanted to say by way of introduction, so I'm now pleased to hand over to our first speaker, Emily Dresner from Natural England, who is going to be setting the scene for us in terms of the policy context.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Ali. I'm one of the people who's not pre-recorded, yeah, all live as you're listening to me. As Ali said, I'm just going to briefly set the scene with a quick overview of policy mechanisms operating in the freshwater environment, and we'll take a look at how we can work towards shared goals when we're thinking about restoration measures in freshwater environment. So if we move on to the next slide, thank you. Here's a simple representation of the protection framework in England, our biodiversity protection framework. So we've got our protected wildlife sites, and then the wider biodiversity component as outlined in the biodiversity strategy, currently Biodiversity 2020, which has just come to an end of that 10-year cycle. And then the Water Framework Directive with its ecological status objectives and protected area objectives. And where you can see that overlap in the middle, freshwater conservation is happening in the overlap between those three components, with the best outcomes for the freshwater environment coming about when all of those elements are pulling in the same direction. As you probably know, natural ecosystem function has become a really important concept for delivering freshwater biodiversity objectives in ways that provide that space for all our characteristic habitats and species. So that means we need to think about all the aspects of ecosystem function in an integrated way. So that's hydrology, physical habitat, water quality, and species, so the biological assemblages and the impact on those from either non-native species or manipulations of our native populations. And approaching it in this way provides us a common goal across biodiversity and water outcomes. And this approach also brings with it a range of natural capital benefits such as water quality, flood and water resource management, climate change resilience and carbon storage. There are differences between the mechanisms in terms of how much and how quickly natural function restoration can progress under those mechanisms, but that's at a detailed level, and the direction of travel, the overall impetus, remains the same. So there's been a lot of policy development happening over the past few years, which has created a more coherent focus on natural ecosystem function. And in terms of biodiversity, that's led to the development of this Natural England report. You can see in the middle of the diagram there, the freshwater and wetland habitat narrative. And along the top of the slide here, you can see the various policy influences that have fed into this work. And in turn, this work has driven a range of work streams, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. On the priority habitat side, it has informed mapping work and thinking about our approach to monitoring. For protected sites, we've revised the site selection guidelines for freshwater sites, and there has been a review of our existing sites. And under the Water Framework Directive, there has been the publication of the Biodiversity Advice Pack, led by Ali, which is underpinned by this narrative. So how should we think about the respective roles of biodiversity and water policy mechanisms in promoting the restoration of natural function? Well, local decision making doesn't always make the most of opportunities for restoring components of natural function, whether that's hydrological or physical aspects. The biodiversity objectives work that has been going on, particularly in terms of making priority habitats work more natural function driven, means that WFD planning also needs to reflect this by increasingly focusing on measures that promote that restoration of natural function, if we're going to achieve these synergies between water and biodiversity outcomes that we're aiming for. So looking at these illustrations on the right, that means thinking more about weir removal rather than installing fish passes and making those modifications to existing engineering. So this slide just provides a bit more context around the wider efforts on developing the natural ecosystem function concept beyond freshwater and wetlands. Natural function is the key approach across our biodiversity work for both wet and dry habitats, on the basis that natural functioning of the landscape provides the template for the presence of habitats and species. This is set out in another Natural England report, which you can see here, Integrated Biodiversity Objectives. And these principles will increasingly be coming through in wider biodiversity strategy work as time goes on. So lastly, just thinking about the delivery side of things, there's a lot of activity happening around biodiversity as Bio 2020 comes to an end. A new nature strategy is under development to deliver on the ambitions of the 25-year environment plan, and this involves a range of elements. The Nature Recovery Network will be a strategic England-wide network of habitats, strongly informed by these natural function principles. An NRN toolkit and data hub is also being developed, and that's still currently a work in progress. The details are being developed that will underpin and support the actions being delivered for the nature recovery network. And local nature recovery strategies will be driven through local partnerships, and new stakeholder engagement will be needed to support this. As this work develops, it will need to link with and take account of the existing water work with which you're familiar, particularly river basin management planning with the third cycle underway now, and related water quality and water resources planning processes. And of course, natural flood management is also now well embedded into our notion of integrated natural environment delivery. Climate change related strategies are also in development, including DEFRA's peatland restoration strategy and tree planting strategy, which offer, again, significant opportunities for promoting natural ecosystem function restoration. And the new environmental land management scheme is currently under development, launching in 2024. And again, this work is being informed by principles of natural processes and the restoration of natural function. So there's quite a lot there, and all of that will need to come together in a coherent way for stakeholders to engage with. And there is work going on currently and in coming months to pull these elements together. So that's about it for an overview of the policy context. We'll wrap up there, and we can move on to hearing more detail about the data sets themselves.
Hi, I'm Ali Morse, the Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trust and a member of the CaBA Biodiversity Working Group. I'm going to give you a quick intro into some of the tools and resources already available through the catchment-based approach to support biodiversity delivery by catchment partnerships and others. I know many of the attendees on this webinar will be familiar with CaBA, but I thought it worth giving a bit of an introduction for anyone who isn't. So the catchment-based approach, or CaBA, is an initiative that brings together government, local authorities, businesses, environmental NGOs and local communities to work in partnership to prioritise, plan and deliver improvements for our water environment. There are over 100 partnerships covering every catchment in England, and the work that catchment partnerships do can make a significant contribution to biodiversity delivery, working on our rivers, lakes and wetlands across catchments. But because catchment plans bring together a range of other actions across our water environment, this also creates the opportunity to ensure that biodiversity delivery is built in across the whole spectrum of work undertaken by catchment partnerships, such as flood risk management schemes, abstraction plans, drainage works, and working with the agricultural community. The CaBA Biodiversity Group is one of a number of working groups established to provide specialist input to support the work of the catchment-based approach and catchment partnerships. And the group aims to promote best practice restoration and management, to ensure that catchment partnerships are able to utilise biodiversity data to help with catchment planning, to highlight opportunities to deliver against biodiversity targets, and to tackle the barriers faced when it comes to incorporating biodiversity delivery into catchment projects and programmes. There are already a number of resources available through the CaBA website to support deliverers looking at ensuring that biodiversity benefits are built into their work. And these can be found on the Learn section of the website by using either the menus down the left-hand side or entering relevant search terms. There are a host of resources covering topics including invasive non-native species programmes, natural flood management projects, wet woodland creation, constructing treatment wetlands, and using beaver to enhance wetland habitats. But I'm going to focus on two resources that are of particular importance, the CaBA Data Pack and the CaBA Biodiversity Pack. CaBA GIS Data Package is a set of over 150 data layers provided to catchment hosts under a licence negotiated centrally with data providers. And these data sets are key when planning integrated projects across catchments that will deliver the most for your water environment. There are data sets on flood risk management, water resources, water quality, biodiversity, and so on, allowing multi-benefit projects to be built on a sound evidence base. The data package has two components. Desktop data layers are layers that can only be used in desktop GIS software, but allow the users maximum flexibility to understand, to investigate, combine and process that data. However, as they're held locally, they can soon become out of date. Online data layers are the same layers but made available through the CaBA Open Data website, where they can be viewed either using ArcGIS Online or without any specialist software whatsoever. Many of these are accessed directly from the owner of the data, and so they're always the most up-to-date version that's available. The online data can also be combined with local data and shared with partners in online story maps to underpin local catchment planning. A user guide lists all of the available layers, explaining how they can be used, the source of the data, and any issues to be aware of when using that data. Of the 150 or so layers, almost all of them are relevant to biodiversity to a greater or lesser extent, and so form a valuable resource when it comes to planning biodiversity projects or incorporating biodiversity delivery into other schemes. But there are a number which are most likely to be useful to catchment partnerships when thinking about biodiversity. And they can roughly be split into those that tell you about the existing biodiversity resource and those which identify opportunities for habitat restoration, expansion and creation. We're planning a briefing note which highlights these data layers that are most useful in biodiversity terms, which will be published along with other outputs from the CDEP conference. So some of those which we think are most useful. In terms of existing biodiversity, there are data sets showing designated sites, and these include everything from special area of conservation, special protection areas, sort of international level designations, through to SSIs, AUMBs, national parks, right down to locally designated sites such as county wildlife sites. There are a number of habitat maps provided in the data package, and these include land cover, which shows broad habitat types, the JNCC habitat types, and also priority habitat inventory, which provides the boundaries of habitats which are designated as being of principal importance under the NERC Act. In terms of rivers specifically, the pack contains the detailed river network provided by the Environment Agency, which is a really detailed and useful layer, but perhaps now becoming slightly out of date, and also contains the Ordnance Survey Open Rivers dataset, which is more recent but not quite as detailed as the detailed river network. In terms of restoration and enhancement opportunities, there are a number of habitat potential maps, so for example salt marsh and seagrass, setting out areas where habitat could be restored or recreated. There is Natural England's Combined Habitat Networks dataset, which is what you can see on the slide in front of you. So this pulls together a range of habitat types and identifies areas where they could be buffered and expanded to create habitat networks or corridors. And in the process of being added to the pack is the priority rivers and lakes restoration opportunity areas, which you'll hear more about from Chris very shortly. So the pack has a wealth of information that will be of use to anyone planning a project with a water or wetland theme, whether biodiversity delivery is the main objective or whether it's an added bonus. On now to the CaBA Biodiversity Pack. This is another key resource. It aims to promote the synergies between delivery under the Water Framework Directive and delivery for biodiversity. And it looks to promote the restoration of natural processes as a basis for sustainable habitat restoration and management. The pack consists of 3 overarching guides covering policy, species conservation and methods of prioritising locations for biodiversity delivery, and also 10 habitat-specific guides which focus on how and where natural function can best be brought in as a key component of habitat management and the benefits that this can bring. The policy guide sets out targets under the Water Framework Directive and Biodiversity 2020 governs current biodiversity plan, and highlights the potential overlaps and complementarity between the two frameworks. There's also a section on the 25-year environment plan and the development of a post-2020 strategy for nature, which will follow on from Biodiversity 2020 and is currently in development. And that describes some of the aspirations, which we hope will have specific targets and milestones and monitoring associated with them under the overarching framework of the 25-year environment plan. The habitat-focused fact sheets cover 4 freshwater habitats and a further 6 wetland habitats. They're between 4 and 6 pages long, so they provide quite a sort of bite-sized, digestible introduction for catchment partnerships and other practitioners to some of the current thinking around natural function. The pack itself is heavily based upon Natural England's Narrative Conserving Freshwater and Wetland Habitats, which was published in 2016. That was an evidence-based narrative that sets out the case for the restoration of natural processes in order to maintain and restore habitats and to support species conservation. Each habitat guide sets out key features created by natural function, discusses the current impacts for that habitat type, and describes the key management messages that catchment partnerships could incorporate into their delivery work across the suite of different habitat types. The pack is available to download from the CaBA website.
Hello, I'm Josh Robbins and I'm the River Restoration Advisor at the River Restoration Centre. I'm just going to talk about some tools and approaches that we have been developing to support river restoration, particularly around catchment planning and how we prioritise options and measures to improve our catchments. So what do we mean when we talk about the need for a catchment-based river restoration plan? Well, I've only got 10 minutes, so I've tried to boil it down to 2 key points. First, a catchment plan should include an assessment of all processes, pressures and impacts at the correct scales. Second, it should include evidence-based decisions and prioritisation of measures and techniques. And ultimately, what we want is to improve our catchments as a whole, rather than just single reaches. And in our work over the last few years, we've been asking ourselves, are we actually doing this? So are our decisions actually based on evidence, or are they just based on our experience or sort of a hunch that we have? So I think in a lot of cases we do take a catchment-based approach to river restoration, particularly when it comes to single issues. And fine sediment is a great example of this. So here we've got a map from SciMap, and with this data we can pinpoint the issue in the catchment and we can target our measures and our sites to address that issue. So here we're looking at it at the appropriate scale and we're making an evidence-based decision. But where it becomes more complicated is where we have multiple issues operating across the catchment at different scales, at different levels of intensity. So how then do we make an evidence-based decision on what measures and techniques we should prioritise over another? The good news is that we have lots of great data sets to help us to make these decisions. But they become very complicated when you're trying to consider them all together to help you make a decision. So how do you pick one issue over the other? How do you identify one site over another or one technique over another? It's hard to put all of this data together in one coherent plan. So what we need to do is we need to turn this data into information and action in our catchments. And how do we do this? So we have our data and evidence, our outputs from desktop assessments, site surveys, opportunity mapping, and we need to use this to help us to make decisions in our catchment. So quite often we see that expert judgment is the link between these two. So an expert will interpret the data and identify what needs to be done in the catchment. And that's great if you have an expert or a group of experts that are very knowledgeable, but what happens if you don't have that expertise? And what happens in the future when someone's trying to look back at the reasons why a decision was made and they can't identify it because it was all expert judgment rather than sort of a written evidence or a process that was gone through? So what we really need is guidance and tools that can help people to interpret the data and evidence and feed it into their decision making. And this is what we've been trying to develop, so that we've got a better link between the data and evidence and the decisions that are being made in the catchment. And this will really help us to understand our decisions and understand maybe why some of our projects work and some of them don't. To help with this, we have developed a catchment planning framework which we have applied across the UK and now teach in a training course. This framework helps people to understand their catchment and use that understanding to prioritise projects and make decisions which will improve their catchment as a whole. The framework is based around a hydromorphological framework where the natural drivers of change drive the processes which in turn create the channel forms and then the habitats and species. The key part of our catchment planning framework is the assessment of pressures and impacts at the appropriate scale. This involves looking at the complex links between pressures and impacts across the catchment and identifying where they're sourced and where they are most severe. This is then related to the hydromorphological framework. For example, we can look at if a pressure is acting on the natural drivers of change and therefore cascading down through to the processes, the channel forms, and then the habitats and species. By doing this, we can then start to prioritise issues and measures over others based on where they sit on this hydromorphological framework. This is where we start to link the data that we collected earlier in our assessment and our understanding of that data to the prioritisation of our measures and our options. We have developed other tools to help with catchment planning. So reach delineation, splitting a catchment up into reaches, is really important for the assessment of pressures and impacts across a catchment. So we have a modelled data set which is based on RHS data and also remotely sensed data, and it models the substrate, vegetation, geomorphic activity and flow for every 500 metres of the river network. And plotting these on a graph can allow us to identify changes which might indicate changes in a reach. So it's a really useful data set to help with an initial reach delineation exercise, and then that can then be used and improved upon with ground truthing later on in your assessment. We've also been looking at how we can better use survey data to inform catchment planning decisions. One of the biggest challenges of catchment planning is being able to collect enough data across large catchments to be able to assess them properly. So we've looked at making RHS surveys more efficient by creating a new RHS app. We're developing at the moment a citizen RHS survey form where volunteers can go out and do a mini RHS survey which experts then check in the office and add more data to in the office. We're also looking at how we can better present river habitat survey data and how we can incorporate it into the catchment decision making process. We are developing a walkover survey which can help to pick up pressures and potential impacts outside of the 500 metre RHS site. This is good for picking up every bit of information that you can across the catchment and not ignoring any part of it. So we've tried to make it a quick and efficient form which can pick up those issues. As part of our surveys, we now use 360-degree camera, and this is really useful for being able to capture images across the catchment that can be better interpreted back at the office. It's also really useful if you want another opinion on a site and say you're not sure what's going on at a particular spot in your river, you can take a 360-degree photo, send it to someone that will be able to help you, and they can have a quick look and have a better understanding of what's going on at that site. And they're very reasonably priced, so the one that we use is only about £200. And finally, we are also applying NFM methods developed in France. So we run a training course on this each year. So the map on the left is a map of the historic floodplain, and this is not modelled, it's created using contour maps, aerial photography and an on-site survey. The map on the right looks at flow pathways and storage zones, and that's created with free-to-use GIS software and add-ons and tools. So these are low-cost methods that can be implemented to help to identify potential NFM options or opportunities. So just some key points to sum up. Catchment planning is difficult, especially when we have multiple pressures and impacts across our catchments. And having good data is not enough on its own. We also need to be able to interpret this data and use it as part of our decision making. You can't have a good catchment plan without data, but equally, good data is useless if we aren't able to interpret it and use it as part of our decision making process. We believe the RRC catchment planning framework can help with this, but it's always in development and we'd like to hear feedback on it. So if you'd like to hear any more information, or you have any questions, or you just want to talk about catchment planning with us, please get in touch about the tools and the frameworks I've discussed today. That's the end. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about the habitat network mapping and the project I've been running along with Michael Knight in Natural England for the last couple of years or more. And if you go to the next slide, what we've got is a set of 23 individual habitat network maps. Most of these are driven by the existence of priority habitat with the data derived from the priority habitat inventories. There are a number of habitats that aren't covered, which you can see on the right hand to slide. This is either because there's no inventory at present, or the inventory is so poor that it doesn't justify undertaking that work. And one of those, coastal floodplain grazing marsh, we're actually working on to improve the inventory and take account of natural function. Next slide, please. So how do we create these maps? So for each of these individual maps, we take the priority habitat data layer. We recognise, however, that as an individual habitat, it doesn't work in isolation. So we combine that with what we call associated habitat, which is other habitats that would naturally form the ecosystem with which it would, the species would interplay with. So for lowland heath, something like acid grassland or lowland fen. We then add to that habitat creation sites, and from our database we're having to use the agro-environment scheme options for this. We hope to complete a bigger audit of those to improve the network maps in the future. And then we also have a layer called restorable habitat, which comes from a variety of sources, much of which from the priority habitat inventory itself, based on data sets that have not gone into and been considered sufficiently rich to meet the priority habitat definition. So there's 4 habitat components that form the basis for the network map. Next slide, please. Around these, we then draw an enhancement zone. So that's the darker brown, and that enhancement zone is basically seeks to find locations where these habitat components cluster together. We actually split that enhancement zone into 2. Enhancement zone 1 is where we consider the data shows that it's more suitable for that particular habitat to be created. Enhancement zone 2 is where the information looks like it's less likely that habitat creation could take place, or it's within an urban area. We also, within that enhancement zone, identify those small patches of habitat which would benefit some action to help address habitat fragmentation. And then around this enhancement zone, we look beyond the area called an expansion zone to see how these clustering patches can actually be linked across a wider landscape. Next slide, please. So if you're looking at a project area, it's really complicated if you then try and combine all the 23 individual habitat network maps together. They overlap. It's really quite confusing. So we've done the process for people, and we've created the combined habitat network map. This loses some of the detail from the individual maps, but it does provide a really good first impression of what you have in your area and where you may consider targeting action. The combined map is done through the use of a tool. In fact, all the maps are done through the use of a tool which can then consider individual network maps grouped together, and you can actually produce bespoke network maps for groups of habitats as well. This is the data that's available on WebMap on the Magic data layer and on open data. The individual layers are open data and will be made available as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So let's just look at this again in a bit more detail. So the habitat network maps, they're not the nature recovery network, but they are one of the tools within the NRN toolkit and are listed in the Ecological Networks Evidence Handbook. They provide a standard habitat network mapping approach and this tool from which you can then, or from which we would like to think helps with local decision making around local priorities. What they don't do is really identify local opportunities and local constraints, because we think that's best done at a local level. So local areas can use either the combined map or grouped maps or the individual maps, really depending on the objective that you're looking to investigate. The mapping tool can also be used to run local scenarios subject to staff resources and or your ability to run the tool yourself. And the way it's been developed, it can accommodate extra local data, but we would advocate that that's best done by first inputting that data to the priority habitat inventory. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the NRN is about more than just ecological network, as it seeks to deliver a range of natural capital and ecosystem services. However, the network maps can be used in terms of the enhancement zone contains core areas where the priority focus should be on building ecological resilience. Now, in doing so, you will be providing natural capital and ecosystem services, obviously, but those areas are around the bigger, better, more joined, recognizing that better entails this issue of improving ecosystem structure and function, to which the maps really don't deal with apart from the spatial element of that. And what these can do is help identify where the right habitat should go in the right place in terms of delivery around the 25-year plan. And in terms of the network maps, what we would advocate is careful consideration of putting the wrong habitat into the wrong place, and with the emphasis at the moment on where are we going to plant all the woodland. I think these maps provide a useful evidence base about where the woodland shouldn't be planted, because these areas are important for open habitat development. Next slide, please. Okay, now, as I said, the habitat network maps include both the expansion zone and the enhancement zone, but the expansion zone especially is about where additional habitat can be placed, which obviously will meet biodiversity objectives based on Lawton principles, but it will also deliver additional ecosystem services. And it may be that in those areas, the ecosystem service is your main driver. And what these can do is actually help identify which habitats would be best within those areas for biodiversity reasons. Now, we had been working on a set of habitat potential maps, and we've just had funding from DEFRA to develop these in more detail. But in the absence of those, the enhancement zone and the expansion zone of these network maps does actually represent our best available data for where habitat might be created. So next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So in terms of data availability, there is a list of where you can get the combined map from. The guidance, linked to the guidance document, is there as well. And the individual network maps will be available fairly soon, I'm promised, as a complete national data set from which you can then select. It is important that you understand how the GIS works in order to create the maps in a format that is comparable with what's on Magic or as I've shown on the slides, and there should be a way of doing that. And as I said, the habitat potential maps, we've got some drafts at the moment. They're not really available, and need to be improved. Okay, that's me finished. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Okay, thanks for that, Jeff. And so our next two talks are from Richard Jeffries from the Environment Agency and Chris Mainstone from Natural England. And unfortunately, they can't join us today, but I believe Emily's going to help answer any questions that maybe get raised for Chris's talk. And Richard is happy for anybody to contact him via email with any questions.
Hello, my name is Richard Jeffries, and I work in the Environment Agency geomorphology team. I want to introduce you to some new data sets being developed to help you find opportunities to work with natural processes. I'm sorry I can't be there in person today, but please do email me afterwards with any questions or feedback. I'd really value that, and my email is on each slide. Many of us use spatial information all the time, and you'll know that there's a lot of data out there. Not much of it, actually all that much about working with natural processes across catchments. What processes are there, for example? Where are the different processes happening? How do they vary across the catchment? How healthy or how good quality are those processes? How might they change in future with climate change impacts? So I work in the National Geomorphology team, and we are aiming to use existing information on things like slope, discharge and river location to fill some of these gaps in the data. And we want to map natural processes and potential places where we can suggest working with nature and working with natural processes might benefit us and nature. First, what's the problem? Well, virtually all river ecosystems in the UK are physically modified to some degree or other. I'm not just talking about the river channels, though that's of key relevance, of course. I mean the floodplain, the valley, the whole catchment surface that drain into that area, the whole catchment. When the Water Framework Directive began, nearly 20 years ago or so ago now, we thought 39% of water bodies were subject to significant pressure from physical modifications. They didn't meet good ecological status because of physical modification. And since then, there's been 2 decades of really excellent hard work by ourselves and by yourselves and many others. So we've remeandered, restored, removed culverts, removed weirs, And we're in the third river basin plan cycle now, and as we look closely at the results of how many water bodies have improved since the 39% that were originally identified as being ecologically poor were mapped, well, we realise that although we've had 20 years of work, the number of water bodies with a physical problem is rather worse than 39%. It's actually now 42%. And the reason for this is that the scale of the problem is larger than we thought. We shouldn't be too surprised. After all, we've spent the whole of human history physically modifying rivers in many places. And we've spent 20 years or so trying to fix those problems. But still, there remains the issue that many rivers are physically modified. We don't seem to be making a great deal of progress just yet on the overarching numbers. So we need a step change in our approach. And we've been putting together some information in the geomorphology team that might help us to make that change. But the first thing to bear in mind is that although I'm about to present to you some data, some maps and spatial information, the most important thing is actually people locally. It's you. Rivers, floodplains, catchments are managed and looked after by a dizzying number of people. So the first thing is to work together to bring together people with different skills. And the EA can help by bringing some complementary things to the table. So we can bring things like national data sets, consistent spatial data such as LiDAR or opportunity mapping. We can provide conceptual frameworks or principles or rules that might help you work out what to do where. We can sometimes help gather people information to share knowledge and good practice. If we put those things together, then ideally and hopefully we'll end up with catchments that can, to some extent, to a greater or lesser extent, look after themselves. So we've created some morphology maps and information to map geomorph functioning rivers, and they're available internally only at the moment. We want, in time, to make them available to you externally. Can't do that today, I'm sorry, but I can at least show you what they look like and ask for some initial feedback. And remember, this is a work in progress. It's a proof of concept, not a finished article. We'd really like to know if we're heading in the right direction, so please do email me, as I said before. So we've created 7 layers, a map showing the width of the natural river corridor, a separate layer that shows where river width has been modified, a layer showing all the headwaters and catchments, and a separate layer flagging up which of those headwaters are likely to be straightened or artificial, a layer showing how climate change might affect river behaviour, and it might make the geomorphological process alter. We've created a layer, or working on layers that show where river channels have been artificially raised up above the valley floor or perched, and a layer showing stream power, which is the energy a river has. So I'll just start with that last one, with stream power, because it's kind of fundamental. It underpins a lot of other geomorphic thinking. So stream power has been shown from geomorphological research to be a really important variable that predicts the river behaviour and what rivers might do under certain circumstances if you apply interventions to them or if they're modified. You can use it to identify what kind of river you might have, what sort of behaviour, whether it's active or passive, or whether it might have a gravel bed or not. But most interestingly, it can help you identify whether the river can either restore itself because it's got the energy to do so, or perhaps whether it's been over-widened or otherwise physically altered to a state where it really doesn't have the energy even to recover at all. So it would need physical intervention to help recover. We use this and built on this to create a very crude, but as a starting point, hopefully useful map showing potential impacts of climate change on river behaviour. So this map in red shows where there is a higher likelihood of change as a result of predicted climate impacts, and in blue, the reaches have a lower likelihood of change. As you can see, they vary across catchments using the same catchment. Another layer that we've created is a map showing how width has been modified. Many rivers have been widened or deepened. We don't have much information on the deepening, but we do have pretty good LiDAR data and width measurements that we can use to identify whether rivers have been modified in width. This is quite helpful because it can start to flag up places where the river is obviously over-widened, therefore might benefit from works to bring it to a more natural width. As I mentioned earlier, we've mapped where the headwaters are, and this map is a subset of that, showing the artificial and likely modified headwaters. Headwaters are recognised now as being really vital, that the pillaries of the system, and they're also relatively low cost, low risk places to intervene and do restoration work. So flagging these up can help to identify relatively straightforward interventions that can support healthier ecosystems across a much larger spatial area. Now, if you add all these layers together, you can perhaps come up with a reasonably good understanding from a remotely sensed perspective of what might be a good idea to do where. So you can start to flag up different areas of the catchment where a different approach might be needed to fix physical processes, physical modifications, and where you might put in different interventions to work with nature. So here, for example, in the central area where it's chalk, obviously there's fewer tributaries there, fewer active tributaries. So you might look at tributary work in the headwaters in other parts of the catchment. But interestingly, these large, wide, very sort of drained low valley floors in the middle part of the catchment have a high density of small drainage ditches and networks there that might be quite an interesting place to do a different kind of restoration, perhaps if you've heard of it, a stage 0 type approach. But it's all well and good to lay the data together and put it into a sort of suite to make some use of it, but how do you then decide what you do? Well, we've also put together some simple principles that might help guide you. This is very much just a guide as to where to start. So perhaps focusing on giving rivers space to operate naturally, because many rivers have lost that space, and the data sets can help us do that. In the future, we'll be trying to develop other data sets which help us understand how physical barriers affect the system. We know where most of the barriers are, but what we haven't really looked at is how they affect physical function and natural processes, particularly where there's long lengths that have been ponded, or where there are long reaches downstream starved of sediment. And as I've shown already, there are headwaters which are really important parts of the catchment, and the data should help us identify where those are particularly useful to restore. So that's the end of the presentation, and thank you for listening politely, I hope. If you've got any questions, again, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I really value your feedback. It's richard.jeffries@environmentagency.gov.uk. Thank you.
I lead on running water habitats, and Ruth leads on standing waters. And I'm going to be talking to you now about various bits of work we've been doing under the Priority Habitat driver, mainly focusing on the work on mapping restoration priorities, but a couple of other bits and bobs as well. Just to recap, for those of you who aren't so familiar with the term priority habitats, they're part of our commitment to the International Convention on Biological Diversity, and they do have a legal status. The definitions of priority habitat in relation to freshwater habitats are varied, but in essence they end up meaning that all of our freshwater habitats can be considered priority habitat in one form or another, which is great news, but the problem with that is that it doesn't give us an actual basis for prioritising action, so we have to do other things in order to be able to do that. As you've heard, all of the work on priority habitats has been refocused around the concept of natural ecosystem function very explicitly. We've also been careful to generate a greater focus on habitats that tend to be neglected by decision making in the past, particularly headwater streams, small lakes, riparian habitats, and also the critical linkages to wetland habitat as well, we're doing work to emphasise the importance of those and to promote action. Back in 2014-15, we generated new priority habitat maps for rivers and lakes, and the idea of those is they're seeking to capture the most naturally functioning remaining examples that we have, and this is all part of having a greater focus on natural function. Allied to that, and because obviously in a country like England, we've had a lot of impacts on natural function, so there aren't that many sites that we can talk about in terms of being pretty close to natural function. So this creates much greater importance and emphasis on generating maps of where our restoration priorities are for restoring natural function, and as I say, we'll talk a fair bit about that later on in the presentation. We've also been doing work on developing a more coherent framework for monitoring and evaluating priority freshwater habitat condition. In the past, it's been a little bit ad hoc and just making use of available data. So we've been doing a fair bit of work on that, and all based around evaluating the level of natural function across the habitat resource, rivers and lakes, and also ponds. There's now a website, a publicly facing website, which allows everybody to understand the work that's been going on, and also provides an opportunity for stakeholders and partners to get involved in providing data on particularly on natural function, and also restoration priorities. It's hosted by the FBA, the Freshwater Biological Association. This is a screen grab of the home page of the site, and it's worth just having a look, having a breeze round, and you'll find a lot more information on there about the things I'm talking about today. The website that relates to gathering naturalness information, and this feeds into ongoing refinement of the priority habitat maps. Those maps were generated using national data, and we recognise there's a lot of local information that we need to actually make them more usable at a local level, more accurate at a local level in terms of where our most naturally functioning river and lake sites are. They're often small water bodies rather than the larger water bodies that tend to get a lot of focus under WFD, and there is a lot of work to do there in actually getting out and identifying where our most natural, particularly headwater streams and small lakes are. So we've devised these assessment methods for naturalness. They're divided into these four main components: physical, hydrological, chemical, and biological. Anybody can add data. It's via the data portal on the FBA Priority Habitats website. It's deliberately a simple assessment process to maximise engagement with the public. And the idea is that data will be pulled together off the data portal at intervals, and evaluated and used as a basis for refining the river and lake priority habitat maps. Another feature of the website is that all the data that's added can be displayed on map widgets on the website, and the data is completely open, can be used by anyone, and including CaBA and within the data hub. These are just a couple of screen grabs again from the website. The bottom one is a part of the naturalness assessment form. This is one's for rivers, and it just shows you the geolocation device for identifying, where your site is. Some of you will know that when we produce the priority habitat maps for rivers and lakes, we also produced national maps of restoration priorities. Now, obviously this was based on national data, and as with the priority habitat maps, we're wanting these restoration priority maps to be locally relevant and to promote schemes and measures that local partners know are the best for that area. And what we're doing is putting in place some functionality on the FBA Priority Habitat's website, which is broadly similar to the naturalness assessment functionality in the way it works, which will enable local partners and stakeholders to identify locally relevant sites. The whole process, unlike the naturalness assessment work, is the data entry is devolved to catchment partnerships. There's guidance available to help with this, and the idea is that participating partnerships will manage a workspace for their area where lakes and river sections can be highlighted as priorities, and supplementary information can be provided on the nature of the restoration that's intended. One important feature of this work, and it does set it aside from other data sets that you've been hearing about today, is that this is not so much a data set as an opportunity at the moment. It's a blank sheet of paper, and partnerships can colour that in and use it to promote where they want to be prioritising for action in their area in respect of restoring natural function. And the screen grab here is just a part of the data entry form. Again, it's very simple. We're not after a great deal of information here. It's just enabling people to highlight what components of natural function are a priority for restoring in a given location, and then there are free-form boxes to say something more about that. It's actually being trialled by some willing partners. A few partnerships have put their hands up. We're very grateful for them to test out the process, iron out any glitches, and the idea is that the functionality will be made live on the Priority Habitat's website pretty soon. It's certainly sometime in September. Any catchment partnerships are eligible to sign up for this. We'll provide an alert when the system's ready, and there'll be guidance available on the data portal. Individuals and participating organisations within the partnership will be able to add suggestions, but the partnership lead will be confirming what goes forward and is therefore viewable on the map widgets on the website. We're working on processes now to live link the data through to the CaBA data hub. And from there, the information will be available to catchment partnerships for their CaBA pages and their submissions to the RBMP3 planning process. More broadly, the maps will be uploaded into the Nature Recovery Network Toolkit, which you've heard a bit about today, and it will also be available for adding into the targeting tool for implementing the environmental land management scheme that's currently being developed and is going to be launched in 2 or 3 years' time. We'll also be using these maps as we do currently with priority habitat maps and restoration priority maps in various permitting processes in relation to planning, Natural England consenting, and Environment Agency permitting. Just to give you more of an idea about what kinds of restoration measures are relevant to map, these are, I'm going to show you some tables of measures for rivers and lakes that are taken from the guidance document that will be on the FBA Priority Habitat website in due course. And it just they're not meant to be definitive lists of appropriate measures, but they give a flavour of the kind of measures we're talking about that restore different elements of natural function. And in relation to rivers particularly, we've given some indications of measures that aren't relevant to this exercise. And we're doing that because there's a lot of work goes on river restoration up and down the country. Some of it relates to restoring natural processes and some of it doesn't, and we need to make sure that we are capturing the right sort of restoration schemes in this exercise. So for instance, in terms of physical river naturalness here, we've got measures that relate to restoring riparian trees and natural delivery of fallen wood and retention in the system. In relation to establishing natural zones of transition between valley mires and even upland mires and the stream network, rather than more engineered sort of approaches that might tend to put in dams and weirs and bunds in places to mimic some of the hydrological elements of natural function, and to just aim to provide stability to the channel and maybe to upstream mires. So that's a broad idea. I don't want to go through all of these in detail. It's just to give you a flavour. In relation to hydrological measures for river restoration, I mean, really it's all about restoring natural flow regimes by dealing with issues at source, be they abstraction, water transfers, impoundments. It's not about mitigation measures such as artificially augmenting flows or bedlining. Now we're getting on to river restoration measures in relation to chemical and biological naturalness, and we had some sort of soul searching over this really, because there's an awful lot of activity going on rivers in relation to normal water quality improvements, sewage treatment works, upgrades and the like. There's an awful lot of work going on in relation to minor exercises in trying to control one or two non-native species. We didn't want to flood this this restoration priorities map with a lot of these sorts of schemes, and it would have taken people a lot of time to have added them anyway. So we're avoiding inclusion of these sorts of schemes, but certainly where there are major efforts or where there are proposals for major efforts to restore natural chemical or biological function, we want to certainly capture those on these maps, and particularly in relation to addressing pollution at source, whereby there are concerted efforts in the catchment to take land out of agricultural production and put it back into semi-natural habitats to deal with nutrient, silt and other forms of chemical pollution at source. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about lakes now. Lakes are in a different position in the sense that there's an awful lot less going on lakes in relation to restoration, and particularly small lakes, which are, pretty neglected in the context of really both conservation and water management. So we're looking at any sorts of level of action to restore any element of natural function as being something we'd want to include on the Lake Restoration Priorities map. Here are some of the examples of relevant measures to restore physical naturalness. I don't think any of these would surprise you particularly. A lot of issues with outflow structures and management of riparian areas. In terms of hydrology, again, it's dealing with artificial outflows that stabilise water levels and eliminate the natural drawdown that you get through the summer months, which is so critical for a lot of marginal plant species and animal species. Again, removal of artificial drainage in the riparian zone so that we can re-establish proper hydrospheres of vegetation. In terms of chemical naturalness, there's an awful lot of work to do in this area on lakes. So anything that is improving lake water quality by dealing with pollution, either directly into the lake or in the catchment in a significant away for the lake, is going to be relevant for inclusion here. And of course, a lot of our lakes are suffering from historical enrichment over many years, with very nutrient enriched sediments, and removal of those sediments is a key part of restoring natural function to the lake. And then finally, lake restoration in terms of restoring biological naturalness. Clearly, as with rivers, non-native species is a big issue. Removal of excessive numbers of benthivorous fish species, particularly carp, also bream, an absolutely essential element for so many of our lakes. So many of them are affected by carp stocking, and it's just impossible to establish a clear water state with thriving submerged vegetation, even if nutrient levels are reduced by a considerable amount. And the middle photo is interesting. That shows the effect of a fish exclosure on a part of one of the Norfolk Broads, and it just shows the effect of getting the fish assemblage right in terms of re-establishing that all-important clear water state that submerged plants and all the associated invertebrates and animals can thrive. And the map on the right is just part of a larger piece of work that we've done on looking at the naturalness of both lakes and rivers right across the country, with available national data sets. And so just a few final words on restoration priorities. Firstly, just to stress, please think about lakes. There really is not enough restoration work being done on lakes. We're not seeing a lot come through in terms of biodiversity planning or water planning, particularly small lakes, small natural lakes. So please try and give them as much thought as you do rivers. They're incredibly important habitats. And then just a word about mitigation measures. Obviously, all of this work on restoration priorities is about prioritising measures to restore substantial amounts of natural function to rivers and lakes. It doesn't mean that mitigation measures aren't important where it's not possible to restore natural function. Urban areas are an obvious example of this. But it's fair to say that there's an awful lot of mitigation measures included in WFD implementation. There has been in the past and there will be in the future. It's just important to remember that the rationale for priority habitats that we have developed in recent years is just trying to shine an extra light, provide an extra lever to make sure that we're investing enough time and effort in the places where restoration of high levels of natural function is most possible. So that's the take-home message, really. And one last thing, I'd just like to say a few words about a piece of functionality we've just added to the Priority Habitats website. This is to do with chalk rivers, and as some of you will know, way back when in the noughties, chalk rivers were the only river type included in the UK Biodiversity Action Plan priority habitat definition. But since then, priority river habitat has been extended to include a range of other river types, and also actually any watercourse containing a priority species. So, I mean, this is why really the whole of the river network is now considered priority habitat at a basic level. And whilst this is good for river conservation generally, obviously it's bound to dilute the focus on chalk rivers from a national perspective. Now we are doing some work on mapping river types in ways that will help us understand the spread of action and investment of resources across the river network in terms of priority habitat objectives. But we're doing some more specific work on chalk rivers in conjunction with stakeholders because of the level of interest associated with them. So what we've done in the first instance is produced a revised chalk rivers map. The original UK Biodiversity Action Plan chalk rivers map was lacking in a few different respects. Some pretty obvious chalk rivers weren't on it. It didn't include small chalk streams, headwater chalk streams, and so we've been working to generate a revised map that rectifies those issues. We've taken proposals from a report that was produced in 2015 by the World Wildlife Fund, and we've also done some GIS analysis of the river network in relation to outcropping chalk. So we've generated a provisional revised map to work from, and now that is on the Priority Habitats data portal, and there's a new form on the data portal that allows anybody to suggest further additions or deletions based on their knowledge. And the idea is that after a certain amount of time, and we haven't put a timescale on it at the moment, we'll collate all the responses and we'll finalise the map, and that will replace the use of the existing chalk rivers map. So it'll feed into river basin management planning, water resource planning, and what have you. So that's all from me. I'll just leave you with a few sources of information we can go to for to get more detail. Do use the Priority Habitats website. It's designed for stakeholders to get easy access to information and to raise awareness of priority habitat work. And there's a whole list of more detailed documents here you can go to if you want to dig down into further detail than that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that was the end of our presentations, and we've just got a few short minutes for a few last questions. So if all the speakers who are here today, if you could turn your videos and mics on, that would be great. And I'll maybe start by, we've got a couple of open questions still. So I was going to ask you, Emily, or I don't know if it's one maybe for Jeff. There's a question from Jenny Rielden about how the EA morphology mapping links to the priority river restoration mapping work. I don't know if you can say anything on that.
I think that's one more for Jeff, actually. Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm afraid it's not. I think if Chris had been here, he may have been able to answer that one, but maybe we could take this offline and talk to Jenny directly. And apologies to everybody else that would like to have heard the answer.
Yep, sure. Maybe we can add it to a sort of Q&A document after this that we can circulate to people.
Sure, yep.
And so we've got a question from Fiona Bowles, who's asking, she's saying a programme for this priority habitat data development would be really useful for planning the NRN work in catchments, as there feels to be pressure to do this before the evidence sets have been published. So is there anything you can maybe say on sort of timescales for publishing the data sets and evidence?
If you're talking about the toolkit, then I think an initial toolkit will be published sometime in September. But that, we're very much in DEFRA's hands for that, and it's not part of my work. But definitely there will be pilots for the local nature recovery strategies, and those will be piloting that initial list of tools within the toolkit. So I'm not quite certain when it becomes fully available, or whether it just becomes available to the pilots. So yeah, sorry, it's not. There's too many people now for me to keep track on exactly what everybody else is doing and the timescales around all of this. But there definitely will be a toolkit available with data at some stage, hopefully soon.
Is that something, Ali, that the Biodiversity Working Group can follow up with to sort of give people more updates on this as it develops?
Yes, I think that's something that as we know more about timescales, we can communicate that out through the CaBA website and maybe CaBA newsletter.
Okay, and we'd also had a question beforehand, Ali, about if partnerships had other data or tools that they were keen to get hold of that they couldn't, how they could get in touch with the Biodiversity Working Group.
Yes, that's a really good question. So the summary of biodiversity data sets that are already within the CaBA data pack, which we are going to publish after this webinar, will have contact details at the bottom, so that if there are data sets that people identify that would be really useful to support their catchment delivery and they can't access them, then they can contact the Biodiversity Working Group, and we can work with the catchment data user group and try and get some of those data sets made available, or maybe point you in the direction of them if we know where they're already accessible.
Thanks, Ali. And I was just going to maybe ask Emily as a final point, sort of in terms of the restoration priorities mapping, and Chris sort of mentioned in his talk where the data will be used, just to sort of emphasise again the importance of partnerships getting involved in that and sharing those priorities, and how that can sort of maybe help release and access funding through the different drivers.
Yeah, it's very much a tool that's going to be at the disposal of local partnerships to really express what their priorities are, and so that then gives the opportunity for those to be expressed through the river basin management planning process, and as you say, for those to be drivers for different funding streams that will become available. There was also a question about how often that will be refreshed, how often the data set will be sort of picked up from people inputting their local priorities, and that's very much going to be driven by how much people use it and how much data gets uploaded. And for Chris and Ruth, who are leading on the restoration priorities mapping, to then pick up that data being inputted.
Thanks. And I think it's something that we talked about before, but when the system's live and partnerships have had a chance to have a look at it and have a go, do you think it'd be worth maybe following up with another webinar to sort of show people really the sort of practical ins and outs of using the systems, and ask any questions that they've had?
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. As it gets underway, I think it'll be much easier for people to see how it works in practice, and for us to be able to demonstrate, how the portal works and how the interface works, and the ways that we can use that information.
And there's also, I believe, a few partnerships that have been trialling it. So we're thinking that once the data is available to be able to pull into the CaBA open data portal, we could work with some of those partnerships that have been trialling it to show then how they've able to pull that into their sort of online catchment plans and use that, and also demonstrate that maybe as part of the same sort of follow-up to this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've probably reached the end of the time. I don't know, Ali, if you want to say anything, any final thoughts?
I think just to say thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for all your questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, do keep an eye on the CaBA website and CaBA newsletter for details of various future upcoming webinars and other events. That's the way that we'll keep you posted with our plans, and we'll share any updates about data sets and so on.